we looked at this, we'll call it the random long tail in music, and found that it's like 20 times bigger than the traditional long tail. But I think this other mechanism, what's it worth so that people can try more and we can turn out to have more new valuable things, that's an even bigger deal.
At least on the production side, the large firms weren't incentivized to do very much of a long tail, right? In fact, they would want to have a short tail. Now, you have these platforms, and that they're actually doing a lot to help the discovery function.
So even if the platform is profiting from this, maybe they're profiting from this process of allowing, the digital renaissance to manifest itself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Randy Xu with the Luohan Academy, and I have the privilege and pleasure of sitting down today with Professor Joe Waldfogel at Carson School of Management at the University of Minnesota, where he is Associate Dean of MBA programs, as well as Professor of Strategic Management and Entrepreneurship. And Professor Waldfogel is very familiar to many of us at Luohan Academy for a lot of pioneering work, and in particular in the last, in recent past, in his research on the creative industry, as well as the writer of 3 books. They include most recently Digital Renaissance, The Tyranny of the Market, as well as Scroogenomics. So Professor Waldfogel, we're glad to have you here today. You recently presented on a research that you're doing covering, how Spotify uses playlists to change their negotiating position, potentially with kind of the major record labels. And you yourself have done a lot of research over the years on the kind of creative industry. So before we get started, I would love to, I would love to ask you what kind of triggered this interest, this longstanding interest of yours in the creative industry.
Well, I guess all these things happen a little bit by accident, but way back in the 90s, I got interested in radio broadcasting, partly because I had a personal interest in music, but partly because it was a very interesting industry economically. Steve Barry and I started talking about free entry and its efficiency properties. And what was interesting about radio broadcasting, and a lot of media industries, frankly, is that they have high fixed costs, but low or zero marginal costs. And so that's a kind of a recipe for interesting outcomes and differentiated product markets. The reason being, well, 2 things. One is, if I add a product to a market, or add a station in that case, in that context, to a local market in the US, what I do is I mostly divert listeners from other stations. I maybe partly expand the market, but I partly just, quote, steal business from others. Now, what that means is it's very possible to get too many stations, because a lot of the benefit to me from opening a station is really stolen or borrowed. Stolen's too strong a word, but borrowed from other participants in the market. Now, it's not bad necessarily. It adds variety. Maybe it pushes down ad prices. But still, what's interesting about it is there's no reason why the market would deliver you the right number of stations. And so, thinking way back to early days, I wrote this paper with Steve Barry about free entry and social inefficiency in radio broadcasting, in which we documented that radio broadcasting was delivering, something like 3 times too many stations from the standpoint of maximizing the welfare of all participants. Again, we as listeners enjoy having variety. So, but anyways, just sort of get back to your question. One thing leads to another. I was studying media before the internet came along. I started writing about newspapers, and I wrote about radio and television. Then the internet came along and kind of changed everything. Because first of all, the internet arrived with piracy, and piracy was interesting and threatening because it undermined the ability of product sellers to cover their costs, and maybe it would cause decimation of product markets. Maybe we'd get no more new music or movies or newspapers or anything. That was sort of the concern circa 2000. So anyways, I don't want to go on too long about this, but I had been thinking about media markets, both because they're just interesting, but also because they're economically interesting. And then the internet came along and just radically changed cost structures and abilities to generate revenue, creating just a fascinating mess to be watching for the past 20 some years.
Okay, interesting. So it wasn't because you yourself had some garage band somewhere.
No, I like music as much as the next guy, but I like music a lot. But really, it's more, it's sort of you start studying something, and then you follow an industry, and then things happen. And especially as I have kind of progressed in my career, I started life in an economics department. I was quite happy there. Then I moved to a business school. And one of the things about business schools is you tend to be a little more observant of phenomena happening in the world that are really affecting, well, businesses and consumers. And just continuing to watch these industries as technology changed, I think gave rise to lots of interesting questions that maybe mattered for industry participants and policymakers. So anyways, one thing leads to another, but there's an expression, this famous old Yankees catcher, Yogi Berra, he said, you can observe a lot just by watching. And I think that's kind of true. If you're paying attention to an industry or a set of industries, and you have some embeddedness in the theoretical perspectives, then it becomes possible to maybe learn something interesting and share interesting stories that are maybe somewhat broader than just the contexts that they're about. That's the goal, anyways.
Okay, great. Yeah, by the way, I think I may not have mentioned, so I'm not actually from a academic economic background myself, but where I've dealt with this issue, maybe two ways. One is I grew up in suburban Southern California, where I had quite a few friends in high school that had their own garage bands. So, you hear about the industry this way, and unfortunately, most people don't make it, right? It's quite a pyramid. So you hear a lot of cynicism. But then when I was in college, I did take a law school class on technology law. And, obviously quite a few of the sessions were on copyright law. And then there, you also cover in your book, copyright law, or the foundation behind it was this debate. And some people would say the foundation behind it is that you have a trade-off, right? You have a trade-off that we want to encourage more production of ideas and goods, and we're willing to give a limited monopoly for that. Obviously, in the US, that has kind of been extended, and in other places in the world as well. But when the piracy debate kind of came about, it was, I think the way the media companies were arguing was that this was, stealing. Now, you kind of, in your book, talk about, well, you go to the roots of what is the fundamental goal of all these rules and laws, right? Is to give us richer kind of cultural goods, right? So how do you think of that, maybe as an economist? And, for like people in the industry, on either side of the industry, how should one, how should we think about this kind of trade-off for society?
Yeah, no, great question. So a lot of products are pretty expensive to bring to market. So the paradigmatic example is like pharmaceutical products, which are, we're told it costs like $1 billion to bring a new product to market. And so it's super important to be able to charge money for drugs to cover those costs. Let's just suppose that's all true. If there were something that made it possible to steal drugs and not pay for them, one could really worry that, well, the drug industry would maybe stop developing drugs because they can't, cover the cost with revenue to finance the new production. And interestingly enough, the creative industries, although they don't quite seem like the drug industry, are similarly investment intensive. It has traditionally, I should say, cost a lot of money to bring a new musical album to market, to bring a new movie to market. It's traditionally been quite expensive. And so if all that happened was an undermining of revenue through piracy, I think one should rationally expect, and the industry was super concerned, hey, we're not going to be able to keep doing this. So we're going to go out of business, and consumers will be left high and dry with nothing to watch and listen to. What came to the rescue was that technology not only enabled stealing, technology also enabled much, much lower cost production, distribution, and even promotion. And this is true in music, this is true in movies, this is true in video, television, this is true really across the board, anything digitization touched. And so although there was bad news, and there's no question there was bad news. I mean, if you look at music industry revenue, fell by like 70% between 1999 and about 2010. No question that was bad news for the traditional suppliers. But what happened really interesting, because it became so inexpensive to create new stuff, that even though revenue was collapsing, we had explosions, and that's not really an exaggeration, explosions of new creative content in music, in movies, in television, in books. I mean, just astronomical numbers of new products. And so, why is that? Well, because, if I don't need to do the traditional way The traditional way was to, for example, with an album, was to go into an expensive studio working with skilled labor and then have big expensive promotion. And it cost literally millions of dollars to release an album. And to make a movie, again, similarly, very expensive, lots of expensive equipment, expensive film, expensive everything. Now it was possible to make an album on your iPhone. I mean, GarageBand is a serviceable studio. It's possible to make a cinema quality movie with a $2,000 Canon camera. It has been for the past 15 years. And so production became trivially inexpensive. And because we didn't need to get into stores or theaters or bookstores anymore, distribution became trivially inexpensive. And so the last frontier then becomes just promotion, which is hard, right? When there's such a thicket of products, so many new products. I mean, I think I forget the exact number, but Spotify is adding something like 5 million songs a year. That's an enormous number of products for anybody to try to figure out. So sort of the new frontier now is discovery. Anyways, though, on the one hand, yep, piracy is stealing. But digital cost reductions came to the rescue, so consumers didn't find themselves high and dry. Instead, we found ourselves awash in products, most of them terrible. But the other feature of these industries, creative industries, and frankly, many industries, is that at the time that new products are launched, it's super difficult to predict which ones will succeed. So if you have an enormous number of new books and movies and songs, most of them will be appealing to no one. But a few of them, or a small fraction, will be quite appealing. And a small fraction of a large number ends up being a big deal. And so like the punchline here is that a lot of these new products that came from non-traditional sources, not going through the traditional gatekeepers, have ended up being very economically successful. In books, something like 10% of the bestsellers today are books that were originally self-published. That means no permissions from New York gatekeeping publishers. And similarly high fractions and growing fractions of successful music and successful movies are not coming from the traditional channels. Now, why is that? Is that because the traditional guys are bad at stuff? No, they're as good as you could be at guessing what's going to win, but it's just hard. And so stuff from left field often turns out to be quite important and economically successful.
Sure. And then just to kind of put this in context, I think you have done research yourself that's shown, the piracy was real, but it sounds like you think the crux of the policy consideration should really be, is this giving consumers more creative works at the end of the day?
Yes. I mean, so, if you think about the purpose of copyright policy, the purpose of IP policies, we're going to allow a little of a bad thing, it's a monopoly, in exchange for a good thing. Continued incentives for creation of stuff that's valuable to consumers and society. Now, there is a very deep question that's hard to answer. So my claim is that piracy, which was bad, was more than offset by cost reductions. It still could be that we should have more protection because it's not enough to have 10 times as much as we used to. We should have had 20 times as much as we used to. I think that's almost a silly argument, but it's not falsifiable. So, and stealing is bad. And by the way, and I think technology has come to substantially to the rescue, technology and business strategy on the stealing stuff. I mean, take the music context. Bundled offerings, that is like Spotify type offerings, where you pay a monthly fee for access to everything, have largely undermined piracy. I think most consumers would prefer to either buy a bundle or get the free advertiser supported bundle and get everything without junk rather than stealing. There still is a deep, hard question about whether the rights holders are getting paid enough, and they're always kind of fighting with their labels and complaining about stuff. And I'm not sure what's the right answer. But what is true is that in the last 5 years, music industry revenue has vaulted back to where it was in about the early 2000s. There's been a huge recovery driven by bundled sales of music via Apple Music and Spotify and other services like it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one possible interpretation, at least from my personal standpoint when I read your book, is that the music industry, if you think of it as a singular issue of the piracy, you might think, this is horrible what's happened to them. But they also had practices that may not have been great for the market, right? I think not only do they have practices, but maybe it was in their own incentive to control the channels, to control to in fact to even limit the number of products. I think you mentioned that even as from the 1950 to the 90s, as movie revenue went up, the number of pictures didn't really go up, right? So some of this just went into perhaps some winner take all payments, like the superstar actors got paid more. I'm sure the producers got paid more. So it wasn't like in the cultural industry, which is different than many other labor markets, you end up having a small group of people that kind of win disproportionately. So it didn't seem like there weren't necessarily that many tiers, right, for this industry because of practices. And then we said their own type of bundling where you had to buy an entire album, right?
Yes. But I think it was also very much technologically determined in the US and elsewhere in the world, theater capacity constraints, how many movies can really be revenue generating. Whereas now we don't need theaters anymore. I mean, theaters are still useful for some kinds of movies, but a lot of movies are produced direct to video, so to speak, which used to be a dirty word, but now, I mean, with Netflix and all the other distribution platforms, this is not a dirty word, and we are not in any way constrained. I mean, it used to be a movie could only be viable if a few hundred people wanted to watch it per night, a few hundred people in a small piece of geography. Now a movie is viable if 50,000 people on the planet want to watch it. And so again, we're freed from the physical constraints of space. And I think in a lot of these industries, the need to distribute through theaters, the need to be in bookstores, the need to be in record stores made it really expensive and really limited the number of products that could be exposed to consumers. It wasn't so much an oligopolistic conspiracy, although maybe it was, but I think it was the physical or the economic constraints of physical distribution that have now been, really lifted. I mean, what is interesting though, just as an aside, is that even though everything's been lifted, we still see huge investments at the top. So it's like the traditional players, Iron Man 25 is going to still be worth, spending 300 million on and to produce, because lots of people are going to want to see it. So at the very top, I think we're still seeing enormous investments. It's just that now we have a giant middle and a giant tail of movies that aren't really intended to appeal to lots of people in a local geography and to be successfully distributed through theaters.
Yeah, so I'm not I'm not involved in this industry, so I'm curious whether you have any data on this. Like you said, let's say the top 10 films or top 10 artists still get paid as much, maybe even more, maybe a bit less, but more or less as much as they used to relatively. And then the bottom, the long tail, is potentially getting more. I mean, not the end of the tail, but some part of that tail. Does that mean maybe the second tier? That there's less in the second tier. I'm just trying to think out loud here.
Well, there are I think various industry actors who look at payments from streaming and say, "Gosh, this isn't very much." But it's important to say compared to what. So suppose you were popular 20 years ago and you're not really on the radio. And actually, by the way, the US is super weird in that artists don't get paid for being on the radio. The songwriter gets paid, but we have this exemption. There's no payment to the rights holder for the sound recording for being on the radio. So if you're still being heard on the radio, but nobody's buying your stuff in the pre-digital world, you're getting no revenue. In today's world, when you get streamed on Spotify, you get revenue. Now, it may be small revenue, but small is big compared to zero. And so there's a whole tier of artists who are getting paid small amounts of money, which seems meager, but it's bigger than zero. Whether it's enough to live on, I don't know. But again, the performance, the audio performance on radio didn't used to generate revenue in the US. We're unusual that way.
Yeah.
Now, but I mean, fine. But I think the other point is there are a lot of artists who are saying, and I'm not sure they're wrong, they're saying, gosh, we're not getting paid enough. Songwriters feel they're not getting enough revenue. Other artists feel they're not getting enough revenue. That may be right, but there are 2 points to make. One is we're not seeing a shortage of stuff being produced, right? It'd be one thing if the farmers say, well, we can't make money growing corn and we stop growing corn, then we have a problem. Here, we're not seeing supply shift back. So there are concerns, but there isn't the usual economic crisis that leads to a need for intervention, that there's no new products. And so I don't mean to be callous, but that just seems to be true. We still have enormous amounts of new stuff being created. I guess the other thing is that some of the statistics one sometimes hears about payments to creators are a little bit skewed by the fact that we have so many amateur creators, right? If you just take the average across everybody who's creating, the average is going to be a very small number, because many people are creating kind of on the side, self-published books, dabbling in songwriting, dabbling in being a musician. I'm not saying they don't take it seriously and that we shouldn't take it seriously. It's expression. But if you have a 10 times increase in the number of people doing stuff, well, they're not all going to make as much money as when you had 1/10 as many, partly for competition reasons and partly just because most of them are going to turn out to be unsuccessful.
Yeah. So I think in your book you also talk about this long tail, connecting it to the benefits of variety. And it's actually funny. We interesting timing. We just published a Vox EU article about research that we did on a large book platform in China. And then at least in our preliminary analysis, we found the benefits from variety. More books on a platform, doubled in a few years, outweighed the amount from price, decreases in price by up to 40 times, right? So that one we did with Eric Brian Nolfson. And he had done research before on the value of variety. Do you think in the creative industry, this is, how large of a value do you think this is, compared to what you also said about, potentially you just have a lot of fringe stuff, right? A lot of not so high quality stuff out there. Like potentially, I'm just trying to think of the variety, because especially in the book and music market, there always used to be a lot of books and music. Now, do we just, instead of having one book on topic, do we have 3 books and, 2 of them no one reads?
Well, so this long tail idea is very interesting. I mean, so and let me just talk about this for a minute because I think it's relevant. So we've known for a long time, starting with Eric's work and other people in the early 2000s, that if you look, for example, at the book market, the ability to have access, let's say, just make up a number, to 1 million books at Amazon is pretty valuable compared to even having access to a big bookstore near your house that has 50,000 titles, because there's this 950,000 other books, each of which attracts just a little bit of demand, but collectively there's a lot of value in that so-called long tail. Totally agree. And the new study you guys have done with Eric also shows it's even bigger at this big platform. And I think that's all true. It's all great. It's all interesting. I think there's another aspect, though, to digitization and the long tail, which is not just what's the value of the 950,000 least valuable products, but a different question. Suppose something reduces the cost of creating new products. Now what you have is a huge growth in the number of new products. Most of those are going to be losers, but a few of them are going to turn out to be right tail winners, that is, big selling winners. And so one question is, just of the products that exist, what's the value of the least valuable products collectively? And that's a big number, and it's a valuable, important number. But there's this different notion, which is, if you were to say triple the number of new products, then how many products that wouldn't otherwise have existed but for the cost reduction end up being valuable? Turns out that's a much bigger number. So in a study I did with Luis Aguiar, also my co-author on the Spotify paper, we looked at this, we'll call it the random long tail in music, and found that it's like 20 times bigger than the traditional long tail. So I totally buy that the long tail is a big deal, but I think this other mechanism, which is not just what's it worth to have access to everything, but rather what's it worth so that people can try more and we can turn out to have more new valuable things, that's an even bigger deal.
Yeah. Well, would you analogize it to, I kind of thought of, debating a very kind of quantitative minded friend about when to buy an unlimited subway card in New York, right? And this is someone who works for a hedge fund. So clearly the money doesn't really matter too much, but he just needed to insist that on some month he buy and some month he doesn't. And I was saying, well, if you have an unlimited card, you might do things that you otherwise wouldn't do, and that probably is more than the $60 you save.
That's true. That's I like the analogy.
Yeah. Anyway, that popped to mind. But anyway, so I think that kind of leads to the other question, which is, so some of this is, potentially have much more variety. And then what you said about you can try more now, but to be able to try more, I suppose the other valuable thing that Spotify and these platforms are bringing is discovery, right? And to tie into our conversation earlier, I suppose if you think of, there's the creation or the producing aspect, and then the distribution discovery aspect, the old model where it was concentrated with mostly these big firms, and then you had a bunch of independents, that they did both functions. you know, in that case, I assume, at least on the production side, the large firms weren't incentivized to do very much of a long tail, right? In fact, they would want to have a short tail and maximize, you know, the short tail. On the distribution side, they would also try to do things to help that distribution. Now, you have these platforms, you know, large platforms with many users, and that they're actually doing a lot to help the discovery function.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, music and books are kind of two classic examples because they're both contexts with now enormous numbers of products, which means that the platform, to the extent that the platform can steer consumers toward one product or another, and I don't mean that as a sinister thing. After all, one of the functions of a good retailer is to direct you to you know, help you choose things you might like. But that does mean that there's an enormous kind of opportunity and responsibility in the platform's hands to help consumers find products that they might actually enjoy. And that also gives them potentially a lot of power. And it also, you know, well, can put them at odds with their suppliers. And I think things like that are happening in music and in books, both of which are traditionally dominated by a few big firms. And those few big firms traditionally really kind of called the shots and made decisions about what would see the light of day. And those traditional big firms still have, I think, the best probably quality products. They have the best authors, the best musicians, and so forth, best artists. But now there's an enormous fringe of other stuff which the platforms can steer consumers toward, and the platforms can see by consumer behavior that consumers are enjoying those products, and those new products then constitute, I think, much more of a competitive threat to the traditional suppliers' products. And that's, I think, what's happening both in music and in books in kind of interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you could phrase it in a very sinister way, but you could also phrase it, I guess the way you just phrased it is, well, you know, like to your Spotify paper, if Spotify says we're going to play less of the major label goods, which you know, generally dominate anyways, and play more independent artists, if you said that to people, I think most people intuitively would say that's probably a good thing, right?
Well, I mean, a lot of people would, just because they'd like to. I mean, some folks like, you know, indie music and new music, but I think what Spotify may be in a position to do is to discover which other songs consumers might like. So they're able probably to substitute indie fare for major fare without degrading the consumer experience. That's what I suspect anyways. And it seems consistent with what they're doing. I mean, and this is not, you know, this is in their annual reports. I mean, they're sending less of their annual payments to the majors plus Merlin over time. And we see it in these data as well.
Sure. I mean, obviously, if a platform, you know, tries to steer, if it happens to produce its own goods and steer to its own goods, that raises a lot of issues. But it seems like in this case, if we start with our conversation at the beginning of what is the goal of, you know, of our society in terms of content, it sounds like it's coincident with that goal.
I mean, it certainly could be. The platform, I think that the place where it gets interesting is, and I think public policy around the world is starting to think about this, is when a platform is not only a powerful kind of downstream distributor, but also is itself a competitor of the upstream folks. And this is not unambiguously bad. After all, we see all kinds of store brand products at many stores, and we don't get upset about that. I think the question maybe becomes, well, what happens when the platform is a big share of the product market? And so it's really, you know, it's as if it were a bottleneck through which all the upstream products need to pass. And then I think it probably warrants, let me be discreet. It probably warrants greater scrutiny at that point to think about whether there's a public policy issue. But it's not obvious that there is, because all kinds of stores engage in, you know, store brand sales, and we don't get upset about that.
Yeah, I think you raise a very good point. I mean, your point is we should try to think of this in a very analytical way, and not just, you know, sometimes things might sound bad compared to traditional intuition, right? But as you said, there's lots of store brand things. And I think in our experience, if we look platforms around the world, they often engage in, say store brands or sometimes setting up a unit that competes with suppliers to increase their bargaining position. They're not trying, usually we find they're not trying to dominate the market, but they increase their own bargaining position compared to powerful suppliers, or two, they want to improve the customer experience. And they feel like, they have a role. If they inject themselves in the market, they can improve the customer experience. I'm not sure exactly how the creative industry will evolve, but it seems like, it's hard to imagine one player, even a powerful platform, would suddenly dominate the upstream market, or that they would even want to. I don't know though.
Well, so my own last 15 years are kind of at odds with another. On the one hand, so everything I did, that digital renaissance stuff, was really about what is it that's going to enable a new generation of producers or suppliers who don't come from the traditional gatekeeping firms. What's going to enable them to, well, try their hand, maybe be discovered and be useful to consumers. And now this more recent work on platforms, we do see both, for example, Spotify and Amazon as these, let's put it a different way, champions of work from non-traditional quarters. So Amazon does it through Kindle Direct Publishing and Amazon Publishing. So the Kindle Direct Publishing is self-publishing, people who, most of that stuff is of interest to no one, but some of it turns out to be very successful. And at Spotify, the 50 million songs include a ton of songs that don't come from the major record labels or even the big indies. And the point is that the platforms, I think, are figuring out ways for consumers to discover this stuff. And so one could consider even a platform kind of pushing this non-traditional stuff as a mechanism for the digital renaissance, or which would make it good. Or one could think about it as the platform strong-arming their suppliers. And so I think we have to think this through carefully and decide whether on balance it's good or bad. But first of all, we should just see what's going on. I don't see a ton of
it could also be coincident, right? Or the two can have a lot of overlap.
Absolutely. No, I think they're exactly. I mean, one could be the mechanism for the other. And so even if the platform is profiting from this, maybe they're profiting from this process of allowing, the digital renaissance to manifest itself. So I guess I'm quite open to both interpretations so far, but I feel strongly that we need some evidence. And so I feel as though there's less evidence than there is rhetoric in many of these conversations.
Sure. Yeah. I wonder if you think, I think the instructive historical example is when radio first came about. I believe those were actually big ticket items back in the day. And the record industry, the revenues went down quite a lot, multiple times. And then that happened over the course of, if I recall, something like 15 years, like the 20s to 35. But after 1935, for a long time, record sales then went up. And it seemed like the two were at least complementary to some extent. So do you think the current stage of this digital media revolution, we're going to, do you think we're very early on in this, or are things at some kind of stable state right now?
Gosh, that's a really good and tough question. I don't know. I mean, right now, I think people are worried about the platforms becoming the new gatekeepers. And so that could, one could imagine scenarios that lead us back to the old world with a different identity of the gatekeeper, but I don't see them behaving that way. I don't see them really restricting supply at all. I do see them steering consumers. So I don't know. It just seems like it's a cliche, but as technologies change and so forth, it just seems hard to imagine things it's hard to imagine things staying any particular way for very long.
Sure. And then one other question for me, it's, the talk of the town now, generative AI. Do you have any thoughts on how this starts to affect the creative industries?
Well, the the question, every so often somebody says to me, you know, we've figured out how to predict which songs are going to be hits, which is not the same question, but it's a related question. And now, well, now we've figured out how to create songs automatically. And if that turns out to be true, I guess that'd be pretty interesting. I mean, as it is, we already have this enormous supply of products. So I guess the question would be whether we could figure out how to create songs or books that are not just similar to the usual nobody buys it books, but rather, you know, similar to the books somebody actually like. Could an AI write a Beethoven's 10th symphony that would actually sound good? If so, that'll be super interesting. But I guess I'll wait till I see evidence of that.
Okay. Okay, great. Well,
by the way, they should do better with Haydn. He has 109 symphonies that they could train on. So they should be able to write a 110th Haydn symphony more easily than a 10th Beethoven symphony.
Yeah, I know. I think people have been using it. Like it's obviously very good at recombining, right? A lot of things. So people have been, you know, writing like new French scripts, like, or like, you know, doing things in the style of, you know, combining Shakespeare and Seinfeld or something, right? So potentially, you know, maybe we'll just end up having a long tail of a lot of these works, right?
Yeah, I guess it would be more like Haydn symphonies. I mean, so it's funny. I'm old enough to have been way wrong about stuff. I remember when Wikipedia first came out, I thought, no, this can never work. And it turns out it works amazingly well. And so I'm not going to embarrass myself by predicting that AI won't be an interesting threat soon.
Okay. Great. Well, I really appreciate this chance to kind of sit down and talk and you know, explore the work that you've done, and then also get your kind of thoughts on all these big questions.
Well, likewise, and thank you for asking a bunch of really interesting questions. It was fun to talk to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We'll certainly be in touch more about your work. Do you have anything particularly that you're excited about that's coming up?
I mean, just sort of a series of things now, thinking about these, you know, the follow on to the explosion of new products is the product discovery process. And so I've been working on that for a few years and plan to continue. I mean, the stuff I just presented on Spotify and the little snippets on Amazon are kind of the next phase in thinking about platform power, but trying to think in a nuanced way about whether it's scary platform power or helpful platform power.
Okay. Well, since you started with a Yogi Berra quote, I believe his other quote that we can end on is, what is it? Like, predictions are very difficult, especially about the future.
That's right. That's a good one. He has one other fantastic quote about people not going somewhere anymore because it's too crowded.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.